Welcome to My Therapist Is Out, an open space therapy collective podcast. We are your hub for queer and trans mental health care. Each episode, we talk with one of our open space therapists or LGBTQ community member about mental health and building community. I am your host, Renae Johnson, they, them. Founder of Open Space Therapy Collective, I'm a licensed therapist and an art therapist. I specialize in working with queer artists who are exploring their gender identity and recovering from complex trauma. This week, we're talking with Jenny Nigro, they, them, and Terra Friedman, she, her. Jenny and Terra are both associate therapists with Open Space Therapy Collective. Jenny specializes in working with queer adults and older adults, and Terra specializes in working with high-achieving women and couples in non-monogamous relationships. As we dive into today's topic, please keep in mind that this is a mental health podcast and we will talk about sensitive issues. If you would like to be informed of any trigger warnings, please read the podcast description. Welcome to My Therapist Is Out. We are so excited to have you here today. My name is Renae Johnson, and we have our open space therapists with us today, Jenny Nigro and Terra Friedman, and I'm so happy that you guys are here.
We're so happy to be here.
Thanks, Renae.
I spoke for Jenny.
That's okay. You can speak for me in this context.
We are, this is our second listener Q&A. We had Chris and Debbie do the first one with us. And we got a bunch of questions in and things that people want us to talk about. So we're going to dive in. But before we do, how are you guys feeling about going through the questions that people have?
I'm super excited. I was nervous, but then I saw the questions and I was like, oh, these are really good questions. Like, I love all of these questions, and I just hope that we can do them justice and, like, you know, put out what people are looking for.
Yeah, I agree. These are all really good questions, and I'm so excited to talk about them with both of you too.
Yeah, awesome. So let's dive in. This first one is an Instagram comment that we got from @AaronThornhart, and they had responded to some videos that we had done about boundaries. And the question is, what if you set the boundaries, but someone keeps pushing up against them and past them, even if it's going on for years? This is a tough one. It happens a lot. What are your thoughts on it?
The first thought that was coming to my mind with almost any question about boundaries is that I think a lot of times people have the sense that setting a boundary is the hardest part, and that is the end of it, right? They finally figure out the boundary. That's a lot of hard work goes into that. But in reality, unfortunately, oftentimes the hardest part is maintaining the boundary. Oftentimes people either won't want to respect the boundary or won't know how yet after the first time you set it. So this question made me think about enforcing boundaries and maintaining boundaries and what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And it also made me think about, you know, when you set a boundary, how are you communicating it to the other person, and how are they understanding it? So it might be helpful to try to ask them, how did you understand what I just expressed to you? What did you take away from that? Do you need examples of what might be crossing this boundary? And, you know, over communicate. And it just depends on who you're setting the boundary with and what their capacity is to understand it and keep it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are both really good points. Because, I mean, one of the things that I know I see a lot is like someone goes through all of that emotional process and that digging about what the boundary is to begin with. And the person that they're needing to set the boundary with isn't there. And so like this person is going through all of this work and doing all this thing, and it's amazing. But like those months of work, the other person is just completely unaware, is not in the emotional experience of it, doesn't understand most of the time that they're even crossing a boundary or that it's bothering the other person. And so by the time you're communicating it, you've got to catch them up on everything and make sure that they understand it. And then your work isn't over. Like, just like you're saying, like holding it, like it's freaky enough to set it, and then to stay there and hold it is a whole nother skill set.
And
Yeah,
I think
it's hard.
Go ahead.
I just was affirming that it's really, really hard. Like it's really, really hard. It's, you know, I am sure a lot of people experience trying to set a boundary and it just gets steamrolled over like you never said anything. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, it is really hard. And I think especially if you're not used to it, right? If this person is new to setting boundaries, they might think or feel like they're communicating maybe even aggressively or too assertively at like a 9, and they might be, for them, communicating in that way, but for other people they might be hearing it as like a really casual preference and not a hard boundary.
What are some things that you have seen people do or things that you've done that have been successful in either communicating and like holding it?
It's a good question. That, you know, the first thing I thought of was like a type of safety plan, where you are articulating and writing down, this is what, you know, if you cross this boundary, this is how it makes me feel. These are the ways I will let you know that you've done that. This is how you can help me in those situations. This is what I need from you. And having both people sort of read through it together. And then when you are in the moment, because it can be really hard, it can be even harder in the moment, to go back to that safety plan that you've created. Okay, someone's crossed my boundary. What did I write down that I would do when that happens?
Yeah, kind of having your current self help out your future self.
Yeah.
When these situations come up, because they get tough and then we kind of lose our gumption.
Yeah, something similar that I've worked with clients on, and therapy is a great place for, is practicing. Like, what would you say? What would you like to say to this person? And how does it feel to say that out loud? I kind of think of it as like you practice whatever you're going to do before game day. Like, you don't go to game day without having done any volleyball practices as a team, because when it's game day, you want it already in your body. You want the muscle memory. So if you've already said these things out loud and kind of had the flinch or the cringe of like, oh, I can't believe I said that, when you say it in your real life, in that relationship, it's not the first time and your body's already a little bit used to it.
Awesome. Yeah, these are great ones. You guys are so smart. Okay, we got a DM from Sherry, who asks, how can therapy help me explore my gender identity? Which is something that people come to us for a lot.
Yeah, it's a great question. And also, there is not a clear-cut answer, because every therapy is so unique to the person that's showing up for therapy and the person that's there to provide the service. And there is no like one way that can happen. So I think it can happen through a lot of different therapeutic interventions. In my practice, since I work a lot through narrative therapy, I might support someone exploring their gender identity by identifying parts of them that may feel more connected to a different gender, or examining their relationship with gender as a concept, and sort of talking through those different stories that they have about different genders or about themselves, and see how that feels and go from there. So that's just one way of many.
I think overall, when I heard this question, I was like, I had a moment of just such deep appreciation for therapy, because in an overarching way, it's a place that you can come and be your authentic self and trust that it's safe, right? Over time, you build the safety with your therapist to know that it's okay if you come in with a different gender expression or a different sense of your gender from session to session. Out in the world, there can be so much pressure to like find who you are, whether it's gender or other aspects of your identity, and commit to that and stay in that one box forever. And I think for a lot of people, I've heard that that feels really stressful because you do all of this work to explore and figure out and land somewhere along the gender spectrum. And oh my gosh, like what if that changes? These things aren't necessarily static. Gender identity, sexual orientation, and therapy is an excellent place to have full permission and full latitude and be welcome to explore the fluidity and the fluctuations that come with exploring gender identity.
Yeah, it's, you know, as you two are talking, it's really striking me how much gender exploration is parsing apart your feelings from it, from what's been internalized or the pressure, the external pressures that you're getting from upbringing, family, even your queer community, and being able to like sit and process how you're really feeling and identifying what's yours and what's somebody else's. And it's really tough to do. And even if you're doing it, you may not feel safe enough or have the energy to make those bigger shifts externally for a while. And so it's great to have therapy as a place to do that safely until you're ready to start doing it publicly. Okay. On that, we got a DM from Matt who asks, in a similar vein, what are mental health experiences that are normal for queer and trans folks that may be missed or not understood or stigmatized by cis people or het people?
I think this is a great question, and it is related because one of the things I think about is maybe that disconnection from your physical body, and then the ways that can manifest in a lot of other issues. Another thing that I think of is isolation, depression, things that come with being part of a community that is othered. Suicidal ideation, we know that is much higher for queer folks. And I think across the board, in general, I think that suicidal ideation is more common than we like to think it is, and especially for the queer community. And I do think it is unfairly stigmatized, and that contributes to making it feel even more shameful. And so I think a lot of times what happens with mental health experiences, things experienced by queer and trans folks, is it like becomes this just cycle of shame that is kind of hard to break out of because you're already being stigmatized. And then that's contributing to the mental health issues, which is then further stigmatized. And it's really hard to explain what that feels like to cis-het folks.
Totally. It's, you know, it's interesting. There's a lot of the suicidal ideation we know, umbrella for everybody, is really paired with loneliness and isolation. And when you're of a minority or stigmatized community, that isolation happens in every interaction that you're having because you are othered or you're feeling othered. And so there's a lot of, even when a queer trans person is doing well, they may still have suicidal ideation thoughts in their normal kind of everyday life because there's that kind of continual isolation, rejection, loneliness in most of their interactions with the world.
And the other thing that I think is a common experience for queer and trans folks is that sort of hypervigilance, like just never really being sure if you're safe, always having to be on alert. Is this a safe space? Is this person going to harm me? And that just kind of like becomes baked into your day-to-day wherever you go, unless you live in like queer utopia, which I'd like to go there. But that is, I think, a very common mental health experience for queer and trans folks, that they might not, you know, that's something that's usually manifested in the body. And when you're also disconnected from your body, then it's kind of this like invisible symptom that you might not even be aware that you're experiencing.
Yeah, I was thinking about self-doubt too, even before some of these other things can have time to come up. If somebody is questioning or trying to figure out for themselves or take time and space to understand where they lie on the gender spectrum or sexuality spectrum, the constant kind of barrage of the default, like the cis-het default, and just how long folks can struggle with trusting themselves through no fault of their own to find peace and belief in their own identity, and how every interaction, like you were saying, Renae, every interaction can discount intentionally or unintentionally somebody's identity. And building up that self-trust back up is something that I've worked with people a lot in therapy, and it's absolutely possible. It is a challenge. It's a challenge to reconnect with your own signals, whether they're emotional or physical, and trust that again.
You know, that reminds me of another question that we got that puzzles in really well with this, that I didn't put on our list, so my apologies to or sent it over, was like the importance of having a queer or trans therapist, because this can happen in the therapy room too. Is if you're with a therapist who doesn't share some level of your identity or some level of like your lived experience of being othered, the therapist can reinforce that self-doubt very unintentionally, but it can cause a lot of problems. I just had a phone consultation for a client with another mental health person that they're seeing, and in that conversation, the other therapist misgendered our client the entire time, even though I kept really reinforcing it. And so and this therapist isn't trying to do it, doesn't realize that they're doing it. The person that I work with has very positive experience in therapy, but those slips really can continue to reinforce that self-doubt and that isolation.
Even something as simple, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Even something as simple as a therapist needing to be explained to or taught about aspects of the queer community that are that therapists should be familiar with, you know, being looked at with a look of confusion. Oh, what is that? I've never heard of that. Huh, interesting, right? That might be really well intentioned, but it's also stigmatizing and can be really triggering for people who are like still trying to find their footing in the queer community.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some things that you've heard from clients, or as queer people who are seeing your own therapists, what are things that you've experienced when sitting with a therapist who isn't part of our community?
Oh boy.
I've experienced a lot of minimization of how significant certain experiences and interactions are for me as a queer person. I think a lot of times there's the intention to, it's like, oh, it's okay, like it's not that bad, like you can get through this. But when that is coming from someone who is not part of the queer community, it just feels very it's like a little pat on the head, you know. They're there. And that's very frustrating.
I'm like running through my mental Rolodex.
I know. I really just picked one like thing.
Yeah.
It's like, we don't have time.
Yeah, I think somewhat early in my going to therapy experience, I had a therapist ask if I was sure about a piece of my identity, and talk about like, you know, using the kind of the classic language of like, this might be a phase and things like that. And I think that set me back a couple of years. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, there was even a therapist that I saw a few years ago that I really liked. And he was extremely helpful. And I was going through some like major career stuff, and the place that I was working at was super toxic. And he was really great at helping me with that. And only that part of me could show up in the room. And so it was a very separate, like even more splitting of my identity, where like part of me, like the professional part of me was growing and those tools were growing, but the queer identity, the relationships, that stuff was kind of like stuck in the same place, if not going backwards, because I had to keep it out of the room because it didn't feel safe with him, since he didn't really get it. And there wasn't anything explicit that he said, but it was just the general vibe of like, this doesn't feel safe to explore. I don't know that he's equipped to do this. And it's, you know, years later that I'm still like, what was happening? Like, why is this one area strong? And it took me a lot longer to get this other piece to catch up. Okay, so speaking of, Jenny, since you brought up body disconnection, we got a DM from Eric who asks, how is it that the mind, body, and emotions can be interconnected and disconnected at the same time without even being aware of it? And there's a like second piece to this, that is, and how can it impact behaviors and feelings in unexpected or unexplainable ways?
I love this question. I'm obsessed. I think this is a great question because even the idea of interconnected, I think sort of societally right now, we're kind of tuning into what has been ancient knowledge, right? Knowledge of peoples who are not colonizers forever, is that the body, the mind, and the emotions are more than interconnected. They are inseparable. Like emotions are physiological processes. Our body doesn't know the difference between thoughts and reality. So when we're thinking about disconnected from one another, it's impossible. The thing that we're thinking about often is that we've learned or been taught by society, by our families, by circumstance sometimes, to like turn off the radio for a specific frequency. So a lot of people in kind of Western society have sort of turned down or turned off the messages that we're receiving from our physical body. So we're relying on mostly thoughts and sometimes emotions. And this can impact behaviors and feelings in, I don't even want to say unexplainable ways, certainly unexpected. But I think the great thing about therapy is that we can make these unexplainable ways that we're impacted make perfect sense. And so a lot of the impacts can look like physical pain, physical discomfort, becoming triggered by sensations or emotions or thoughts that we're not aware of, and then that impacting how we feel or our relationships. So I could go on about this for forever, but I love this question.
Yeah, it's a really powerful one. And a couple of episodes ago, we had Lindsay Stevens on from Crystal Case Apothecary, who talked a lot about this and like has really been exploring how to decolonize her mental health over the last couple of years and really be more in touch with the body. And previously, like she had said in the episode, like previous therapy was like about worksheets and very like studious type of stuff. And like that's, well, that can be helpful tools. Like that's a tool. That is not what happens in therapy. Therapy is getting into the body and connecting these things and turning all of their frequencies back on. For those of you out there, if you haven't listened to that episode with Lindsay Stevens, it's fantastic. I'd highly suggest it. Jenny, what are your thoughts?
I think Tara really just summed it up perfectly. You know, this is something that I'm personally working on myself a lot. And it's, for me, I can now, like Tara said, explain, like I understand and I can explain, but sometimes it's the connection is just still not there. So it's really something that, again, like you both said, can be continuously worked on in therapy. And like any muscle, like if it's atrophied, we can build it back up. And, you know, you can, if you learn something and unlearn it, you can relearn it. You know, you have the capacity to bring those parts back together and turn those frequencies all back.
Yeah, and I think one of those,
go ahead.
We've seen like stereotypes. I think the stereotype of questions that therapists ask, it used to be like, oh, and how does that make you feel? And I think one of the newer stereotypes is like, where do you feel that in your body? Right. And I actually had this realization with my own therapist. It's a question that I ask. And then when my therapist asked me, I had the realization that she might want to know. She's probably curious where I feel that in my body, but that she's trying to habituate me in the 1 hour that we have together. She asked me that question multiple times so that I get used to asking myself that question. So that's certainly something that I ask clients and in different ways. But for anyone out there who's like, that's just a stereotype and not a helpful question, there's reasons we ask.
Absolutely. Like so much of what you do in therapy or what your therapist is doing is trying to get you used to doing it for yourself. And so it can feel corny or cheesy, but it has a very, very specific intention. And I don't know, I ask people how they're feeling or say more about that a lot. And I like giggle at myself every time I do it because I know like that it is such a stereotype and it's probably so frustrating, but it's important for people to continue to learn to deep dive on their own and then not need us anymore. Yeah. In this vein, and this is from a TikTok comment at GSCHM. When we're talking about the body, mind, emotion connection, we often talk about the vagus nerve. And they are curious what the vagus nerve is.
The vagus nerve is super important.
Yes.
I believe it's the longest cranial nerve, and they also call it the wandering nerve. So it starts cranial, like, so your head starts up at the top of your head or at the top of your spine and goes throughout the body. And it plays huge roles in in the regulation of tons of body systems and processes. And I think it's super popular now because we're learning more and more about the vagus nerve's role in like trauma responses in the fight, flight, freeze
Mhm.
Well, whichever sort of phrase you use to remember it, it is, like Tara said, responsible for a lot of the systems that are the opposite of the systems that go into effect when we're triggered and having a trauma response. So rest and digest is the opposite of fight and flight. And so if your sympathetic nervous system is triggered, the fight and flight is activated. If your parasympathetic nervous system is activated, then the rest and digest goes into play. And this would take a whole other podcast to really like talk about fully, but it is super important. And I also learned that it's sometimes referred to as the brain gut axis, which is easy for me to remember. And that really like reminds me what it is. I'm like, oh, it's the thing that does the thing.
And Jenny, you were just talking about a muscle, like getting familiar with, you were talking about getting familiar with your body as muscle, and the vagus nerve can be strengthened. Like you can increase, they call it vagal tone, meaning that you're more able to regulate back into the rest and digest space from being triggered to fight, flight, or freeze. So there's all different, we can talk about that in a different episode, but there's all kinds of things.
It's pretty cool.
It is very cool. And like, it's exciting that our field has kind of discovered it and figured out different ways to utilize it, because it's also a tool that you can use to get yourself out of a panic attack faster. You can use to lift yourself out of a depressive state faster. Kristen Crow, who's one of our therapists, does a lot of somatic tips on our Instagram and TikTok that are really engaging the vagus nerve to help you strengthen that vagal tone and get you moving so you can have more choice and more integration as you're moving through. Cool. Okay, one last question. And this one's for me, and I'm curious what you two are doing. So we are about to head into the holidays. And as you were saying before, it's that kind of a mental healthscape of a time. And I'm curious at what you two are doing to prepare for it, what your clients are doing to prepare for it, because there are so many expectations of the perfect, shiny, happy holiday family, and that's really not very many people's reality.
Yes, so the Jewish high holidays are already in full swing, and there's so many, like you're saying, Renae, there's so many things that come up around holidays, so many family related things, so many financial, monetary things that come into play. And I think one of my favorite things to do when I'm not sure if I'm doing something or making a choice because I want to and it feels right for me, or if I'm doing something because I feel like I'm supposed to and I have to do it. I just made a tip video on this on our social media, but I say it out loud. I say both things out loud. And this is something I've been sharing with clients too. Share both choices out loud and notice what your body does with those choices. Like notice which option makes your stomach clench or makes you smile, and just have that data going in. Maybe it really is something you have to do. Maybe there's someone difficult that you do have to see, but at least you can be connected and acknowledge and like be there for yourself rather than ignoring it.
Yes, be there for yourself. That's exactly, self-compassion is what I always go back to, and what I always really try to build up with clients all the time, but especially heading into the holidays. You can be there for yourself. You can give that love and nurturing to yourself. You don't have to wait for someone else. You don't, a lot of times the ways we might be interacting with family can be maybe we don't get what we need or what we are hoping for. And I find it helpful to remind myself, like, I already have it. You know, I have it. I just need to turn it inward. So I think that's really important. And of course, I'm all about a safety plan, as I mentioned. It's great to have a holiday safety plan. Like Terra said, you know, verbalizing it, also writing it down, same thing, how it makes you feel when you see the words written down on a paper. I'm a visual person, so when I see something, when I write something down and then read it back, I'm like, oh, that's what that looks like. Like, now I see it very differently. And I do that a lot with clients too. I'll have them write something and then later we'll revisit it. And it's just like, who wrote this?
Mm-hmm. I love that idea of writing it down.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I think is helpful, and I'm trying to remember to do for myself also, is aftercare. Like we talk a lot about this when we're talking about sex, but I think it's really important with social situations, especially tough ones, is like we put a lot of energy into prepping for it, getting ready for it. Like, okay, I'm like grinning and bearing it and like, this is tough. And then we just kind of expect it to be over and, oh, thank God it's over and we can move on. But you also need time to decompress from that, process what's happened, treat yourself really like gently. And, you know, if you're a big extrovert and need to be around people, then be around people that are sweet and loving and safe and easy. Or if you're more introverted, you know, relax and wear all your cozy things and have your tea or your wine or whatever, and like just allow for that space so your nervous system can regulate, so you can understand what's been happening. And then when you're ready, move on to the next thing.
That reminds me of, I forget which Nagoski twin sister wrote Burnout, but they talk about dealing with the stress after you deal with the stressor or dealing with them separately. And so I think that made me think of that, Renae, that yes, the stressor will be over. Maybe you had to go to a function and see someone that's really difficult for you to see, but then the stress is still there. Like the stress is still in your body until you address that as well. And for different people, that looks different. I love the idea of tea or wine. Some other people need other things, but can I say a different one too?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I want to replace my other one. I think that because the holiday season is so wrapped up with this perfect idea that you're talking about, whether that's a perfect idea around family or gifts or clothes, material items. And I think it's often really helpful to kind of scale back and evaluate quality versus quantity. Like, do you have to go to every single event and buy every single thing that you think you're supposed to? Can it be pared down so that you actually get to be present in the moment and enjoy your holiday season, rather than feel rushed and stressed and pressured to either like live up to an ideal or conform or perform for everyone around you?
Yeah, that's a really important one, and really tough if you've got people pleasing tendencies to say no.
I also think, go ahead.
No, I was just going to be cheesy and be like, and a great thing to talk to your therapist about.
Exactly.
Totally. I was thinking about how isolation and loneliness can actually be so much higher during the holidays. Whether you're around a lot of people or not, you can be, you know, that feeling of like being in a room full of people and like not connecting to anyone. Or a lot of our queer community doesn't have contact with family or people they celebrate the holidays with. And, you know, it doesn't have to be holiday related. Just find some space you can connect with someone else, or an animal or nature or whatever the case may be. It's not like, it's just a date on a calendar for a lot of people. And it can also bring up a lot of painful memories and reminders. And there can sort of be that tendency to just run away from it altogether. So in that case, I always suggest just coming up with a ritual for yourself that makes you feel joyful. It does not have to be holiday related, or it can just be your version of the holiday. And try to, yeah, just find some way to experience joy.
Yeah, I know one of the things that my partner and I do every year is to find a queer bar that has a potluck happening.
Yes.
And just there's been a couple in San Francisco, and since we've moved down to LA, it's COVID, so we haven't found it yet. But there's always a few that will just have open doors, bring a dish, everybody brings something, and it is just like light and fun and easy. And everybody there is just also in a very similar place. So it can be a very like warm and fun and silly thing to do.
Sounds awesome.
You guys are the best. Thank you so much. This was really beautiful for me to hear. I feel like I get spoiled in these podcasts, being able to just dig into your insights and your thoughts about everything. As we're ending, one of the things that we are founded on at Open Space, but also that we're doing with the podcast, is really building that community and really getting away from the isolation and finding safe and play and in the good and the bad and the ugly and all of the things in between. So I'm curious if you can share a moment in the last week where you had a connection with your community, what that looked and felt like.
Okay. My moment of queer community in the last week, I was at work and a coworker that I don't interact with very much was writing down my name to leave me a note. And they were thinking Jenny, but then they were also thinking Jenny uses they, them pronouns. And I think they're non-binary, like NB. And so they wrote down Jenby, Jenby. And I thought it was the cutest thing ever. And they were like, yeah, this is why I wrote Jenby, because I was thinking Jenny, non-binary, Jenby. And I was like, okay, so now you can call me Jenby. It's great. It was great. I loved it.
That's really cute.
Yeah.
I went with a friend to go see Bottoms. Have either of you seen this film yet?
No. How is it? I've heard all about it.
It was representation.
Ooh.
Which, like, I'm sure it has flaws. However, going to see a silly queer movie where the plotline isn't about how it's hard or bad to be queer, it's just about being a person who happens to be queer and the things that come up in their lives. And it was so fun, and it was a theater full of queer people just laughing uproariously at this goofy movie. And like my inner queer child was just so happy to have like a high school movie for me.
So cool.
Awesome. I had a friend randomly pop by who I live next to a park, and there was a Rosh Hashanah event that she was at. And she's like, "Oh, I'm like half a block from your house. Are you around? Can I stop by?" And it was a queer friend of mine, and just like randomly like popped over, and we like hung out and for a few hours out of nowhere. And it was like one of those perfect moments where I'm like, I have social energy and somebody I love is coming over randomly out of nowhere. This never happens. This is amazing. And so that was a very cool community connection moment this week.
Nice.
Okay, thank you so much. You are both just fantastic. please listen, subscribe, rate, review, all of the things that you do for podcasts. We also want to hear from you. If we'll have another listener Q&A in probably about 6 months. And so we are collecting questions. Please send them our way and we will get to them as we can. If you want to follow us on social media, you can do so both on Instagram and TikTok. We have the podcast, which is My Therapist Is Out. You can find us on that handle. If you want to learn more about Jenny and Terra or book an intro call with them, you can find them at our website or on the social medias at Open Space Therapy Collective. And of course, our website is openspaceTherapyCollective.com. Thank you both so much. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, Renae.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. If you're in California and looking for a therapist, visit our website at openspacetherapycollective.com and book a free intro call with one of our therapists. If you're enjoying My Therapist Is Out, please rate, review, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. My Therapist Is Out is an Open Space Therapy Collective podcast. Our therapists are Renae Johnson, Kristen Crow, Debbie White, Jenny Nigro, and Terra Friedman. Our podcast editing is done by Smash and Grab Studio. We'd love to hear from you about today's topic, so you can email us at info@openspacetherapycollective.com. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at My Therapist Is Out and Open Space Therapy Collective. Thanks for listening.